Kura, Namaste, and greetings to all. Welcome to the Hihiko Webinar Series presented by UC Business School, supported by Asia, New Zealand Foundation, and powered by the India-New Zealand Business Council. My name is Sandeep Sharma, Chapter Head for India-New Zealand Business Council for Christchurch and a proud alumnus of UC Business School. I will be a moderator for today. The topic for today's webinar is Unlocking India, What Next for New Zealand? India and New Zealand have a long-standing and friendly relationship. The ties go back to 1800s when Indians settling in the city of Christchurch as early as 1850s. There are approximately 250,000 New Zealanders of Indian descent, which make up to 5% of the population. A recent report commissioned by Whātākere Indian Association reports that people of Indian ethnicity in New Zealand contribute to around 10 billion New Zealand dollars to the economy. In sports, both countries share the passion for cricket, which also happens to be the unofficial language of business in India. We often see business person in India using cricketing terminologies like bouncer, googly, and my favorite, hit wicket. Focusing on trade, India represents an enormous opportunity for New Zealand. In the year 2020, our two-way trade relationship was worth nearly 2.5 billion New Zealand dollars. There are approximately 140 New Zealand companies already active in India, with 23 having their offices in market. New Zealand exports wood, coal, wool, aluminium, and fruits to India, while Indian imports into New Zealand are mainly pharmaceutical, precious metal, machinery, textiles, and apparels. But have we really reached the full potential of this relationship? And is there more that we can do to increase the bilateral trade between these two countries? Today's webinar focuses on how do we build on what's already been said? What are the pragmatic ways to approach the Indian market? And with current travel restrictions in place, how do we reach out to the Indian market and who is accessible in New Zealand to help? To answer these questions, we are joined by a panel of experts. But before I introduce the panel, I would like to request Susanna Jessup from the Asia New Zealand Foundation to please introduce herself and tell us about her involvement with India. Susanna, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Sandeep. Kia ora katoa. My name is Susanna Jessup. I'm the Director of Research and Engagement at the Asia New Zealand Foundation. We're really pleased to bring you this discussion today, the latest in a series of Asia business focused webinars that we're co-delivering with the University of Canterbury Business School. Today's discussion focused on India, a country very close to my heart, as somewhere I have lived and worked. But that's also the focus of much attention and analysis internationally, just because of its sheer size and the sense of opportunity and potential that abounds around that. But we know from our research at the Asian New Zealand Foundation that India is not a particularly well understood country here in New Zealand compared to, say, our knowledge of North and Southeast Asia. And perhaps because of this, South Asia tends to be rated as less important to New Zealand's future compared to other regions. But there are really good reasons to challenge this perception. Even without a formal trade deal, we know India is going to be consequential to New Zealand's future. And the degree to which we understand and are skilled in cooperating in and with India is going to impact our future and our future security and prosperity. So today's discussion helps shine a light on what those opportunities might be, but also provides a chance to examine some of the fishhooks that can trip up new business ventures, or not so new ones. I know in our audience we have some amazing talent, people with real experience doing business in India, so it's really wonderful to have you along. Thank you for joining us. And from the team at the Asia New Zealand Foundation, many thanks to you and to the University of Canterbury Business School, to our experienced panel for joining us, and Sandeep, thank you for moderating today's discussion. Ngā mihi.
Thank you, Susanna, for that overview. I agree, India is going to be consequential to New Zealand even without a formal trade deal, which is why we shall not be discussing anything about the FTA or RCEP in today's discussion. And now that I've got the attention of our panelists and caught them off guard, let me start by introducing them, starting with His Excellency David Pine, who joins us from New Delhi, India. He is the New Zealand's High Commissioner to India. He's also the High Commissioner designate to Bangladesh and Ambassador designate to Nepal. An experienced diplomat, he was New Zealand's High Commissioner to Malaysia and Brunei Darussalam. He had previously served in New York, Canberra, Kuala Lumpur as Ambassador to the Philippines. Between 2015 and 2019, David also worked as a private advisor for companies and individuals, including ASEAN Advisor, KYS, Aventura, San Miguel Corporation, Christchurch City Council, and International Rugby Academy of New Zealand. Welcome, David. Our second panelist is Esther Guy-Meakin, Senior Manager, Strategy, Trade Policy, and Advocacy at Meat Industry Association. Esther has a background in trade policy and trade negotiations. Following a diplomatic career at the MFAT, she was the lead goods negotiator for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and India-New Zealand FTA, and a legal advisor for Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. She also served offshore in New Zealand High Commission in New Delhi, India, for 3 years between 2014 and 2016, where she focused on market access for New Zealand companies and trade and economic policy. Welcome, Esther. And a final panelist for today is Mr. Samir Handa, Chair of India-New Zealand Business Council. Samir has been doing business with and in India for the past 2 decades. He was responsible for setting up sales and factory in India for New Zealand company Patent Refrigeration. Currently, Mr. Handa is on the board of Bank of India, New Zealand. He is also a member of the Institute of Directors, New Zealand, and is on board of several New Zealand companies with interests in India, including his most recent foray in the lighting industry, Global New Zealand Limited. He has been honored as a member of New Zealand Order of Merit for services to business and New Zealand-India relations. Welcome to you all. I want to start with asking a question to His Excellency David Pine from a policy framework perspective. David, how do you view the bilateral trade relations with India at present, and what's working, what's work in progress, and what steps New Zealand government is taking to make it better or strong? Your perspective from New Delhi, now that you've been there for close to 2 years in this pandemic time.
Thanks, Sandeep. Thanks very much, and hi to everybody. What a great group of people you've assembled, and a really good opportunity to talk about the relationship and to not talk about an FTA, Sandeep, I promise. But there are pretty big challenges right now in the trade relationship, as we all know. Obviously, taking tourism and education out of the equation in the way that has happened, it's been a huge hit. And there are other challenges too. One quite industry specific, but we've got quite big regulatory challenges to reinstate the log exports. You know, some quite technical issues there to address, to do with New Zealand's, the way New Zealand meets its Montreal Protocol obligations, and doing that in a way that makes the logs still acceptable to India. There's some quite difficult issues there to work through, and as a result of that, we don't have logs coming up at the moment. But beyond that, obviously, the global challenges to supply chains, the costs of shipping that have just escalated over the last 12 months, as everyone knows, I'm sure, you know. Effectively, the cost of a landed container here from New Zealand has somewhere between tripled and quadrupled over the last 12 months. That said, a lot of areas of the trade have been standing up quite well. So we think most of these issues are COVID. The log one's different. We have to work through some technical issues there. But I think as the world normalises, and it will, we will see recovery in all those other areas. But there are still some deeper issues that explain why, as Suze was pointing out, the countries haven't been a natural fit as economic partners in the past. And I think we've got to understand those well. New Zealand's economic success, and let's not lose sight of how successful the country has been built around a model of exports and inward foreign investment. And that's our model, and that's the model that's driven our external economic relationships. It's not a natural fit with what India is looking for. India itself is looking for investment, and we're not a country with deep pockets, and we're not a country with a lot of investment acumen. And we need to think really hard about how we fit better with what India wants. And we are doing a lot of thinking around that, and I'll come to that in a minute. India obviously has been pretty sceptical about FTAs as a model, not just with New Zealand, but it's been sceptical. It obviously, as you mentioned, it didn't sign up to RCEP. But I think one thing, things are changing in India, driven by a different political and geostrategic outlook. And I think the messaging we're getting from India is that it knows that in the long term, India will prosper most by doing business with people and firms and governments from transparent democracies that play by the rules. And I think India definitely sees New Zealand in this light. So as you've seen, it is in free trade negotiations with the EU and with the Australians. They've committed with the Australians to having an early harvest deal agreed by December. But what's driving that isn't the same things that have driven New Zealand trade policy, thinking around comparative advantage and economic liberalisation. What's driving India here is a desire to be closer to certain countries, and they're putting trade in that context. And in Australia's case, the trade negotiations have followed an agreement for a comprehensive strategic partnership that the two prime ministers agreed last year. So while New Zealand is seen in the light of progressive countries, it hasn't developed anything like the depth and breadth of partnership with India that Australia has developed. So we can't assume that a change in attitude to FTAs with some partners is going to extend to a change in attitude to an FTA with New Zealand. And that poses some pretty obvious risks for New Zealand that we need to think about quite carefully. So what are we doing? I think we're trying to address this issue of what India needs from, what India itself needs in terms of investment, and think about where New Zealand might fit into that. As I say, we don't have deep pockets and we don't have a lot of that international investment expertise, but we do have a lot of relevant areas of excellence and that are relevant to what India wants. And I think if we go looking to package up that kind of expertise with countries and firms that do have investment expertise and capital, and we'll find them in Singapore, in Australia, in the Middle East, then we can conceivably approach India at a scale that makes sense in an Indian context. Individual consultants going up to India, you know, they'll do some good work, but they're not going to move the dial in a way that's going to change Indian perceptions of what New Zealand has to offer. So there's some quite interesting thinking. There are some of our business leaders are putting their thinking hats on and thinking about how we make those type of connections. The other thing that's changed is that India has reminded us that we did actually sign a trade agreement in 1986, and we do have a trade agreement. Now, comparing the 1986 trade agreement with a modern, highly detailed FTA is a bit like comparing the Treaty of Waitangi with the Indian Constitution. The agreement that we have in 1986 is just a very high level 2 to 3 page document that that sets out some aspirations, whereas a modern FTA is full of quite tight rules and quite specific commitments. But I actually think this could be a strength. And I think what it sets out is that we will commit to meeting together once a year, and we haven't been doing it, that we look in a creative and in a creative way, in a spirit of partnership, at things we can do to lift the relationship and deepen the engagement. And what we want to do is use that 1986 agreement as a hook for an annual NZ Inc. to India Inc., not G to G conversation, where we bring together in a similar way to what we've done with the Australians and the Americans and the leadership forums. And we bring together our business leaders and government leaders, and we have some meetings together and some meetings separately, and really try to develop an agenda and an action plan as opposed to a treaty and a set of legal rules. And let's see where that approach takes us. I think it might be the right approach for India, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Some really interesting points over there, David. The annual NZ Inc. to India Inc. And I know Samir on a panel over here is a veteran as far as these high-level trade delegations going from New Zealand to India are concerned. But going back to what David mentioned at the beginning, which is the New Zealand model of exports and looking for investment inward investment. And that's exactly what Samir, India is looking at this point of time. And so what's the entry point? What's the foot in the door? What are those goods or service sectors that, according to you, New Zealand companies can look at in order to have a natural advantage in the market and start that business and dialogue going? Or if there are some examples already that we don't know of?
Yeah, Sandeep, there are quite a few industries, but before getting into any specific industry, I think one thing everybody knows that India does provide a scale for all the Kiwi businesses. So that is one thing we lack here is the market size with the 5 million people. If we want to do anything big or a bigger scale, then India certainly is a market which gives us that opportunity to scale the things. In terms of industries, of course, pharmaceutical is a hot one at the moment where, in general, we in New Zealand import 60% of our pharmaceuticals from India directly or indirectly anyway, but that's another field which can do more than that. We, of course, have IT and BPOs, which many Kiwi companies use India for, and in fact, many countries around the world use India for that, for their BPOs and IT support work. There are many industries, as David has already mentioned. Education and tourism are the ones which were big before COVID, but we are suffering on those at the moment, which hopefully will get back to. Certainly education as a priority and maybe tourism a bit later on. Yeah, textiles is another one which I think India is very well known for, but we don't see as much textile coming to New Zealand as it should. I see a lot more from China than from India, whereas I know India, it is a strong point. But yeah, there are certainly some of those opportunities I see at the moment.
Right. So pharmaceutical is the, may I say, the flavor of the season right now with COVID in the background and all those paracetamols coming from back home, which is good to know. But Samir, you touched upon, of course, the challenges that some of these sectors currently are seeing, education and tourism being at the forefront. I want to go across to Esther and, maybe just challenge this as being maybe, of course, yes, there are challenges, but is it also maybe that transactional relationship and short-sightedness? And I want to get into human relationships, because tourism education is all about developing those relationships. And Indian market, with your experience, Esther, because you spent 3 years over there, is all about developing those relationships. We see some countries really going hard and investing more in their resources at these tough times. And while some others in New Zealand landscape are really retracting or sitting back on the sidelines, maybe all the hard yards that have been done in the recent past just going to waste by not really engaging with the market or not having a plan. So I guess what works well in New Zealand, India context as far as relationships are concerned in your experience? Is there something that you would like to share on that front?
Yeah, thank you, and kia ora and namaste, everybody. Yeah, I think, India is such a huge economy and a huge opportunity that I think oftentimes people see those opportunities and they're like, magpies, very excited by the shiny opportunities that India presents, but perhaps don't have that longer term commitment or the resilience, I suppose, to really invest in India in order to see the benefits, because it is a long game in India. There are a range of challenges there, and relationships are one of them. And what I often saw when I was based there is that people get very excited. They come over to India, they do a bit of an exploration, they meet some lovely people, really impressive people that they think that they can progress a relationship with, and then they go back to New Zealand and they think that kind of has opened the door. And you're not going to unlock the India market with just one visit, or even 2 visits, or even 3 or 4 or 10. So what I would say about the relationship, and to be honest, this is actually like this world over, but I think probably particularly important for India, is that you really have to be deliberate, be consistent, and be committed to India, to continue to go back to build those relationships. You're, like I said, you're not going to unlock that with one visit. You're going to have to, see that through, possibly over a number of years. And so I think what I saw in terms of a more successful formula was companies that were very targeted, didn't see India as a 1.3 billion consumer market. They saw it, in terms of a much smaller niche. So very targeted, quite realistic about what they were going to achieve, because, even after a year of working to get your business off the ground, you might see very, limited results. So you needed to be realistic about how long that was going to take you, and to look at your business plan in a manageable way. So again, thinking about your segment, who you were targeting and where, because again, I think one of the mistakes that New Zealanders make when approaching India is to think of it like New Zealand. You know, we're a very homogenous kind of market and country, and of course India is not. You know, many of their states are much larger, even geographically, than New Zealand. Yeah, so I think, you know, some common themes I saw there in terms of the recipe for success, or people that were gaining more traction, was that investment in time and resource in India. You know, those who had made the commitment to have a presence in India, whether that was actually someone physically there, or they were coming up to India, and, you know, this is of course pre-COVID times where it was possible, but, you know, going into the market 4 or 5 times a year, and, you know, having those regular touch points in person. And also often actually having a local partner was also, you know, of great benefit, because it, you know, allowed them to navigate some of those trickier regulations, but it also opened the door to further relationships, and, you know, and that's a particularly important thing in India.
Mm-hmm. Well, coming back to Samir, Esther raised some really good points as in terms of building relationships and growing your business in India. It's not a short-term game, it's a long-term game. We all know that. It's about relationship. We all know that. It takes time. It could take even 4 visits a year or more than that, or sometimes even 4 is less. Again, we know that. But from a Kiwi business point of view, there are a lot of Kiwi businesses who are in the audience today. And looking at India, having certain resources, aspirations to grow internationally, probably India is on their radar, not on their radar. And they have another market, which is more easily accessible, maybe smaller market, but probably they could make success over there in short time. I'm not trying you to sell India away. From an India-New Zealand Business Council point of view, what should we be saying to such a business? Why should they be coming to India despite of all of that? Size being one, yes. But what are the other factors that come to your mind? Why should people come to India?
So I'll say it from 2 perspectives. One is India as a market for Kiwi businesses from sales point of view. But I think equally important is India as a sourcing place for Kiwi businesses, which is again an opportunity rather than having all your eggs in a basket and trying to source everything from China. I think India does offer an alternative for many bigger businesses in New Zealand to source some of the things from India as well. And there are a few companies who are doing that, those who understand, and they're doing it or they're working on it. But from the selling point of view, as you mentioned, India is a big market and offers a big opportunity. But at the same time, as Esther highlighted, you don't take or tackle India as a one market. You start with a focused approach, either either state by state, or you go on your own segment, whether it's the hospitality industry or it is whatever food industry, whichever industry you pick. And then within that, then you position your product at a premium level rather than trying to please the masses, which we can't do. So yeah, it's all about positioning our brand and our position in the market and the segment and the region of India, which we are going to work on. So these are the things which I think we need to be looking at from Kiwi business perspective. What our strength is, what India offers. And in terms of doing business, I think it is easy and easier in many ways to deal with India, which is, as we all know, a lot of business is done in English anyway. So language is not a barrier compared to many other countries. And, a lot of similarities being a Commonwealth country and all that. So, but yeah, I think the key thing is building a relationship or having somebody in the middle as an agent or a JV partner or somebody to, bridge that gap between you and the company you want to work with in the long run. And that is also true that India is not a market if you want to get some quick results out of it. So if you are going to commit to India as a market, you need to look at a long-term view. So it does take time and persistence to work through Indian market. You need to spend time, you need to visit, you build a relationship, You try business with small trial shipments before you build it up to volume business. So yeah, those are the things we need to be considering.
So India is basically it's not a market for everyone, and people should look at it from that perspective, but also it's a great place for developing an alternative rather than having all eggs in the same basket, as you mentioned. Of course, India is big and it's broad, but one of the disruptions that has happened in the era of COVID is in the area of e-commerce. I think India's e-commerce space is growing at 20%. It's expected to grow at 20% and grow over $100 billion in the next 4 years. David, I was reading the Trade for All Advisory Board's report, which you chaired, and that had a section about the opportunities for New Zealand e-commerce trade. How do you see Indian market in terms of e-commerce space?
Thanks. Look, just before we get to that, though, I really do want to reinforce what Esther and Samir have been saying. I think, it's been well known for a long time that what it takes to succeed in India. And, as Esther was saying, 10 trips might not unlock it for you. And, there's not a lot of companies that have got the resources and the capability to put that kind of investment in the relationships. But the one thing I've seen that's been common to the people who've succeeded here is fundamentally they love the place. I mean, I don't think you're going to do very well in India if you don't love it, precisely because it takes that kind of commitment. So, I mean, I think you come up for your exploratory visits and the judgment you're making isn't even in the first instance just about the business opportunity. It's, do I like this place? Do I find it interesting? Do I want to be here? Do I want to come back? And if the answer to those questions is no, well, you probably should look somewhere else. But if you're coming here with your eyes open, I reckon for a lot of you, the answer to those questions will be yes. It's a fantastic, vibrant, interesting place. I think, if you come with that attitude, I think you're already halfway there. And when I think of the people, and there are many Kiwi business people who are doing well up here, that's the one thing they have in common. They love it. Maybe that should be India's marketing slogan. India, you've got to love it. Yes, well, look, I mean, the e-commerce stuff is largely happening. And right now, it's not at a level that requires, from my desk, a lot of government to government stimulation. I think it's taking place largely, it's following the education pathways, and it's following the people-to-people linkages. And there are some quite interesting things going on in that sector. But right now, it's not as significant a part of the G2G agenda as the things we need to do to get things going on the more physical side of life. So, if I thought about the priorities that it would take to really lift the relationship, if I got my wish list ticked off, pretty high up on that wish list would be air linkages, right? If we could get that a direct air service, that probably would be the most transformative thing. I think we would have got there by now if COVID hadn't hit. I reckon we were that close, and I think we'd be there now without COVID. And I'm hoping that post-COVID, we pick the conversation up where we left it off rather than starting all over again, because the demand is there. And even if tourism is a bit slow to pick up again, even if education doesn't come back in the same way, the fact that 5% of our people are of Indian descent, and more than half of them have moved down in the last 20 years, meaning their connections back home are even more recent and stronger, means that that demand for travel will be there. So I think I did want to touch on tourism and education more than e-commerce at this point, because I do want people to know that our colleagues in Tourism New Zealand and Education New Zealand haven't been sitting here twiddling their thumbs. Right now, they haven't got a product to sell, but they're working really, really hard. And you'll see the fruits of that work in a few years' time. But they're preserving market consciousness, brand awareness, preserving and building brand awareness. They're preserving and strengthening industry relationships in both sectors, both tourism and education sectors, that we'll need to have ready to go when we're ready to reopen.
So you got to love India. That's a good message that we're getting here. If you don't love India, then and cricket, of course. But I also checked last that India also has a rugby team. So if you love rugby, then also you can go India and basically help India build a rugby team as strong as our cricket team. And going back to again those relationship-based P2P opportunities, people to people, peer-to-peer opportunities that it creates in the area of trade. There was, because I did promise we're not going to go talk about free trade agreement, but there was a report which was helped commissioned by the Meat Industry Association called Wanted New Trade Agreement Partners by Sense Partners. One of the recommendation over there was to encourage flexible and forward-looking approach, diversification of New Zealand's free trade agreement network, and basically moving away from free trade agreement based approach and building maybe sector to sector or business to business sort of trade agreements or business transactions. As you know, India has individual states which have their own policy. At times, business could probably align their strategy with those policies as well. Do you see that sort of approach working as part of the business strategy?
Yeah, so that report that you referred to, the Meat Industry Association helped to sponsor that along with the International Business Forum. And just by way of context, before I get on to answering the question, but that report was really commissioned because we have, thanks to successive New Zealand governments and negotiators, a really impressive network of FTAs. So, for our sector, as an example, 58% of our global exports are covered by free trade agreements that New Zealand has in place. So incredibly successful. And there aren't that many, key markets, I guess, that, we don't have an FTA with. So this report was really looking at, well, what other opportunities are there, market-wise, but also, are there different ways that we could approach this trade policy question? And the New Zealand government has, over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, followed a mantra of comprehensive, high quality, tariff elimination type approach. And that has worked really well for us. It has meant that we have had really outstanding FTAs that have given us incredible access. I was looking in preparation for this webinar back on some of our own stats, and in 10 years alone, New Zealand's FTAs have, so since 2010 to 2020, New Zealand FTAs have reduced the tariff burden just for our sector alone by 52%. Now we still pay around $175 million in tariffs every year, but that's an incredible difference to our community. So that said, I'm a huge support of New Zealand's trade policy. It's really delivered for New Zealand's businesses. It's made us the export heavyweight that we are. We punch way above our weight. But I do, in saying that, think that it might be time to begin thinking about how we can approach trade policy in a slightly different way that will allow us to unlock maybe that next generation of trade opportunities that might not be so easy. And India probably falls into that category. That being said, there is no way that I would ever advocate for an approach that wasn't WTO consistent. And so, that's very important. And, in the same way that our FTA and trade policy, has given us real results as a business community, the WTO is the foundation of that and has, really leveled the playing field for us. So I would never advocate for an approach that went contrary to that. But, when we look at markets like India that are slightly more, that are more tricky and pose a lot of issues, and a tariff elimination, while certainly ideal, is not necessarily the answer. FTAs aren't necessarily a silver bullet. And, my example when I talk about this is Malaysia. We have 4 FTAs with Malaysia. And our trade as the red meat sector is, still very, excuse the pun, but undercooked. There's a huge amount more opportunity in Malaysia, and it's very difficult to progress that because of non-tariff barriers. And so when I talk about creative approaches to trade policy, I'm really talking about, well, how do we look at non-tariff barriers and clearing away things that are commercially meaningful that might still unlock opportunities for New Zealand businesses. An example that I recall from my time in India and is now relevant to my current position with the red meat sector is I spent so many hours sitting outside offices in the Ministry of Commerce trying to get import licenses approved for sheep meat imports. And I saw some colleagues from Quality New Zealand on this chat here. So, they were beneficiaries of my time. But, is there a way that we could unlock that process that makes it a little bit more predictable, more consistent, easier to access for New Zealand companies? I don't know whether that's still an issue, but it certainly was when I was there. So it's looking at things like that, not that sexy, very difficult to explain to the public, but make a really big difference to businesses. And, you mentioned state to state, and looking at it more at a state level. And I think that's, certainly something to explore because, as I said in my opening comments, India's a very different place, depending on where you are, different culture, different languages, people look differently. I mean, it's, and different states have different strengths as well. So, there very well might be opportunities in that respect. But I will just emphasize again, it would have to be WTO consistent. And so, it does have to operate in that context.
Samir, Esther brought up the example of one of our INZBC members, Quality NZ, who've been in the market for over a decade. Of course, they love cricket and they love India. And that consistency and all the groundwork, legwork that was done in 2014, from what I'm hearing, 2014-15, is now kind of reaping the benefits, and the commitment to the market is encourage them to even start some sort of processing in the market. Is there a business model in this? Our existing members who have been successful in India, can they be, apart from just being the flag bearer, can show road to the market to others?
Absolutely, and I think that's one thing we don't do enough of is share the success stories, the companies who are doing well in India and the kind of commitment they have made to India. And as you mentioned, Quality New Zealand is a good example. It took them a few years to get established and prove their credibility and build up the relationships to finally get some good results. And similarly, there are many other businesses who have been able to achieve that as well. At the moment, I know Velocity is working hard with the banks in India to get their software across to Indian banks. Raycon is working there, chip manufacturing. Couple of other companies who have done well being Kiwi companies, but unfortunately, they're no longer Kiwi companies anymore. They've been sold like Glide Path and Fisher and Paykel Appliances I'm talking about, and including the company I was representing, Pattern Refrigeration, as a Swedish company now. So there are many companies who have done that well, road to success in India, but I think we need to celebrate that and also use them and their experience for the newcomers to learn from them, to see what works and what doesn't work, rather than having to make the same mistakes again. Yeah, a lot of those things can be avoided by sharing the knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's also another member of ours here in Christchurch, Redesign, who has physically come out of India, but because of the time that they spent over there and the connections that they forged, they still managed to support their designs to some of their partners back in India. So business is still on while the borders are shut. And that's basically what my next question to you is, Samir, is that in these times when the borders are closed and there's no physical movement and supply chain is going through this whole disruption period and expensive delays in shipment, what are the ways to be connected to the market in the space of non-digital? I would say digital, yes, there is, but then you spoke about pharmaceutical. How did that shape out in these times, where apart from the requirement of those medications for COVID, yes, but in future when this pandemic reaches endemic, what happens then?
So in many ways, I would say the timing is really good for Kiwi businesses now. It could be a blessing in disguise, you can call it or whatever, because of COVID now, there's no expectation from either party, either Indian business or New Zealand businesses, to travel or go and meet each other and all that. So yeah, that used to be, as even David mentioned, used to be a big drain on the resources of some of the Kiwi companies. But now there's no expectation for that. So you can actually get a lot of work, a lot of business done by Zoom calls or online platforms, which even personally I have experienced. I set up a couple of new suppliers in India. I haven't met them till today, but we are still started doing business with each other. It's all relationship developed through Zoom calls and webinars and things like that. So there is an opportunity even now. And as I say, even probably easier to do that right now without having any expectation to actually travel and visit and meet. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think Kiwi companies can do more of that. In fact, one of the businesses we're talking about is a pharmaceutical one, where we started sourcing some pharmaceutical supplies from an Indian manufacturer here for New Zealand without actually having met the supplier. So yeah, I think timing is really good.
Wow, so those virtual relationships are also working quite well. That's great. It's good to know. I think it's just about time for us to also move into some of the Q&A questions that we are receiving, because some of them are definitely on my list. And I want to go across to David, as one of the questions we've received here is, given the way the New Zealand government has sidelined India for the past so many years, how do you see the way forward? It's not my question. I haven't made it. It's coming through one of our participants.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely accept the premise of the question. And, you know, it takes two to tango. And we've sort of outlined a lot of the challenges in the relationship. But the question's a fair one. I mean, the two countries haven't been as, you know, as close as they could be. I'm optimistic about it. I think some things are pushing us closer together. And, you know, I think basically the tides of history are moving us in a more similar direction. So I think that will be happening. I've kind of already outlined some of the things I think we need to do. You know, I think we need an air services agreement. I think we need a structured annual economic engagement at the NZ Inc. to India Inc. level, you know, not just a narrow G to G. If you look at the sort of things that Australia might get in its early harvest agreement with India, well, it might get something in critical minerals, which doesn't really concern us too much either way. Mm-hmm. It might get something in fintech, which will be worth a watch because we don't want to be disadvantaged there. But the other things that are likely to crop up in that early harvest agreement are in skills, education, capacity building, investment promotion. We can get all that with India without an FTA in a perfectly WTO consistent way, and I agree with Esther about that. But there's a lot we can do that's really got nothing to do with the WTO rules one way or another. The WTO rules don't, you know, they put some strictures on the way things are subsidised, but they don't inhibit people cooperating to do better quality investment promotion or better quality trade promotion in each other's countries. They don't constrict our ability to be collaborative and creative and do things that really might change the dial. And the other thing, I mean, just to go back to Esther's example of Malaysia, and I know the Malaysian story reasonably well. My own view is that a lot of these things that end up as non-tariff barriers are symptomatic of relationship failure, actually. The reason we have non-tariff barriers in Malaysia is because we haven't built a constituency to advocate for better quality of trade relationship. And, you know, the meat industry has been working in Malaysia for decades, and it's done a great job in a lot of ways, but Malaysia's a very good example of a particular challenge New Zealand faces. You know, in the end, we can't supply the whole world. And if you've got markets like Malaysia, and in a lot of ways, India is going to be in the same category, that aren't in your top 5, but they're valuable markets to have in an area where, say, you've got fluctuations in annual supply. So some years you won't be able to supply them with the particular cuts or the particular quality that they're looking for, and other years you can. That's a really difficult thing to manage in a strategic way when your supply is limited. And how much we are prepared to sort of invest in second-tier relationships as an insurance policy and forego, you know, to what extent are we prepared to forego the actual maximum revenue that we could get each year for the sake of keeping a relationship ticking over and a relationship alive? I reckon that's a really difficult challenge for industries like our meat industry. The Australians, because they're bigger, can be more strategic. I think it's tough for us to be strategic in anything other than dairy, just because we've got a certain amount to supply and our primary job is to sell it. So I do think we've got to keep those kind of issues in mind because they're very relevant to India. And, you know, we've got to be realistic that the sheer mismatch of scale in our productive capacity in their domestic demand does present challenges, and we do need to think our way through them very, very carefully.
Thanks for that, David. It's a great analysis. Esther, the next question is a meat industry specific question. So probably you're in the best position to answer that. The meat industry in New Zealand is the second largest goods exporter, generating around 9.2 billion in revenue. Now, with the large population of Indians being vegetarian and the rise of alternative plant-based proteins and meats, how's the industry adapting to that?
Yeah, well, look, it's that's a phenomena all over the world. It's not just India. And I guess our answer to that is, you know, there will always be people that choose not to eat our product for a range of reasons, and that's entirely okay. Obviously, we would prefer them to eat our products, but you know, that's absolutely within their rights. So look, you know, it doesn't bother us. What we want to focus on is ensuring that the products that we are producing for the people who choose to eat our product is the highest quality, is a premium product, you know, has the highest animal welfare standards. You know, we are meeting world-class food safety standards and all of those kind of benchmarks that set us apart, and so that we continue to be a premium and sought after product for those people who want to eat our products. So yeah, you know, at this stage, you know, we see it in those sorts of terms.
All right. Well, we've got so many questions coming in, but
Sandeep, I can just add something to that.
Yeah,
I can help you. I can give you the latest scientific survey on this. We're hosting a socially distanced barbecue for our staff on Sunday. 20 people, 7 vegetarians, 13 meat eaters. So I think in a country of 1.4 billion, there's still going to be enough people up here to eat our meat.
Great. And the rest can eat paneer. And for the viewers who don't know it, it's Indian cottage cheese. Yeah.
No, that's good.
That's great. We have almost reached the end of the webinar. And I would like to thank our panelists for their time and valuable insights into India-New Zealand trade relations. Our participants who have joined us from New Zealand and in India, thank you all for making time and showing your support and for sending some really great questions. I would also like to thank the UC Business School Asia New Zealand Foundation for organizing this webinar and to the India New Zealand Business Council for supporting it. If the participants today have any further questions, feel free to send it across to the India New Zealand Business Council email address on their website or Asia New Zealand Foundation. I would like to end today's webinar by quoting a Maori proverb translated into English. This was used by our Honorable Foreign Minister, Nanaya Mahuta, at the India-New Zealand Business Council Summit this year. And it says, "Do not lift the paddle out of unison, or our canoe will never reach the shore." With India and New Zealand paddling in unison, we can much more effectively tackle some of these challenges together. Good evening, and thank you all.